Gentlemen, the most damaging comparisons in relationships aren't the obvious ones where she directly mentions her ex. They're the subtle phrases that seem like innocent observations or reasonable preferences, but actually reveal she's measuring you against template her ex created and finding you deficient in ways she'll never explicitly state. When a woman uses these phrases, she's not having honest conversations about her needs or preferences. She's expressing dissatisfaction rooted in comparison to her ex, while disguising that comparison as objective assessment of your behavior, ensuring you're being judged against standard you don't know exists and can't defend yourself against because the comparison remains unspoken and denied. Before we decode these phrases, hit subscribe and drop a comment. If you've ever realized that criticism you received wasn't actually about you, but about how you differ from her ex, your experience might help another man recognize when he's being measured against invisible standard created by someone who's no longer in the picture, but still controlling relationship dynamics through unacknowledged comparison. Phrase 1. My last relationship wasn't like this. The idealized past. Standard. This phrase appears when you're having relationship difficulty or conflict, and instead of addressing the specific issue between you, she references her past relationship as example of how things should be different. Her last relationship didn't have this problem, didn't involve this type of conflict, or handled similar situations differently. The phrase seems like she's providing helpful context about her relationship history, but she's actually establishing her ex's approach as the correct standard and positioning your different approach as deficient by comparison. The manipulation works by using her ex as invisible authority on proper relationship behavior without explicitly saying, "My ex was better than you." When she says her last relationship wasn't like this, she's implying that whatever you're doing wrong was done right in that relationship, which means you're being found lacking compared to standard her ex established. You're being judged against someone you're not supposed to compete with, but compete with him you are. And you're losing comparison she's making, but not openly stating. She'll use this phrase specifically during conflicts or when you're not meeting expectations she hasn't clearly communicated. You're arguing about something, and instead of explaining what she needs from you, she references that her last relationship didn't involve these arguments. You're handling situation in your natural way, and she mentions her last relationship handled things differently. Each reference positions her ex's relationship as superior template, while your current relationship becomes deficient copy, failing to match original. Notice whether her references to past relationship acknowledge its actual problems or only mention it when creating unfavorable comparison to current relationship. Does she ever discuss why that relationship ended or what was wrong with it? Or does she only mention it to highlight ways it was supposedly better than yours? Real relationship history includes both good and bad, while selective memory that only references past positively reveals she's idealizing ex's relationship to critique current one. Watch for whether her statements about how past relationship was different include acknowledgement that different doesn't mean better, or whether different is automatically positioned as superior. Does she recognize that relationships can handle things differently, with neither approach being wrong, or does mere fact that X did things differently make his approach automatically correct? If difference from X is treated as deficiency rather than just variation, she's not sharing history, but making unfavorable comparison. Pay attention to whether she's comparing actual relationship experiences or idealized memories, filtered through time and selective recall. Is her memory of past relationship accurate representation of what actually happened, or has she forgotten conflicts, problems, and difficulties while remembering only positive aspects? When someone references how past relationship was better without acknowledging why it ended, they're comparing your reality to their fantasy about past rather than making honest comparison between two actual relationships. The long-term impact is you constantly feeling inadequate because you're being measured against idealized version of relationship that probably didn't exist as perfectly as she remembers it. You're trying to match standards set by someone who's been filtered through selective memory that erased his flaws and relationship problems while preserving only positive memories, she now uses as weapon to critique ways you differ. You'll never measure up because you're competing against fantasy version of X rather than real person who had actual flaws and created actual problems that she's conveniently forgotten while judging you for not matching her selective memory of past perfection. Phrase 2. I'm used to dating guys who. The preference disguised as history. This phrase emerges when you're doing something that differs from how her exes behaved, and instead of expressing it as simple preference, she frames it as established pattern you're violating. She's used to dating guys who plan dates, who are more spontaneous, who communicate differently, or who handle conflicts in specific ways. The phrase seems like she's explaining her relationship history and what she's accustomed to, but she's actually telling you that previous men did things correctly and you're doing them wrong by comparison. The manipulation works by positioning her ex's collective behavior as normal standard, rather than just how specific people happen to act. When she says she's used to dating guys who do something you don't do, she's implying that you're the outlier deviating from normal masculine behavior rather than just being different person with different approach. You're not being compared to one ex, you're being compared to aggregate of all exes who collectively establish standard you're failing to meet. She'll deploy this phrase when establishing expectations she wants you to meet without directly stating them as requests. Instead of saying, I'd like you to plan more dates, she says, I'm used to dating guys who plan dates. Instead of requesting more communication, she mentions she's used to dating guys who text throughout the day. Each statement tells you what her exes did, while implying you should do the same, creating expectation without direct request that you could accept or decline. Notice whether her statements about what she's used to include acknowledgement that those relationships ended despite those behaviors, or whether behaviors are presented as universally positive things you should emulate. Does she recognize that her ex's approach to dating, communication, or conflict didn't actually create successful relationships since she's no longer with those men? Or does she present their behaviors as superior approaches you should adopt? If behaviors from failed relationships are presented as standards for successful one, her logic is fundamentally flawed. Watch for whether her description of what she's used to includes honest assessment of how those patterns actually felt, or just surface description that sounds positive. Did she actually enjoy having boyfriends who texted constantly? Or did she sometimes find it clingy, but now references it positively to critique your different communication style? When someone idealizes past relationship patterns without acknowledging their actual complexity, they're creating false standard based on selective memory rather than honest historical assessment. Pay attention to whether she frames her history as what she's used to and needs to continue, or whether she acknowledges that new relationship can establish new patterns that might be better than previous ones. Does she treat her relationship history as template you must follow, or is she open to discovering that your different approach might actually be improvement over what she's experienced before? If she's demanding replication of past patterns rather than remaining open to new possibilities, she's trying to turn you into amalgamation of her exes rather than appreciating you as distinct person. The long-term impact is you feeling pressure to behave like her exes rather than being valued for your authentic self. You're receiving constant message that ways you naturally operate are wrong because they differ from how previous men acted, which means you're being asked to perform masculinity according to template created by men she's no longer with. You'll either exhaust yourself trying to match behaviors that aren't natural to you, or you'll internalize sense of inadequacy because you can't or won't become composite version of all her previous partners who somehow simultaneously set perfect standard while also failing to maintain relationships they were in. Phrase 3. Why don't you ever? The complaint hiding comparison. This phrase appears as question about why you don't do specific things, but it's actually complaint rooted in comparison to X who did those things. Why don't you ever surprise her with gifts, plan romantic gestures, remember small details, or initiate physical affection more frequently? The question seems like she's curious about your reasoning or habits, but she's actually pointing out deficiencies she's identified by comparing you to X who did whatever you're not doing. The manipulation works by framing criticism as innocent question rather than direct complaint or comparison. When she asks why you don't do something, you hear curiosity about your perspective, but what she's actually saying is that you should be doing this thing, and your failure to do it represents problem in the relationship. The question format makes critique seem gentler and less confrontational, while still delivering message that you're failing to meet standard established by behavior she experienced with someone else. She'll use this phrase specifically about behaviors her ex performed that made her feel special, valued, or loved. Why don't you ever leave love notes when her ex used to leave them regularly? Why don't you ever plan elaborate dates when her ex was known for romantic surprises? Each question highlights specific area where you differ from ex in ways that leave her feeling less valued than she felt in previous relationship, even though she may not consciously realize she's making comparison. Notice whether her questions about why you don't do things include openness to your explanation, or whether she dismisses your reasoning regardless of what you say. Does she genuinely want to understand your perspective, or is the question just an indirect way of telling you that you should change your behavior? Real questions involve curiosity about answers, while fake questions are just criticisms disguised as inquiries where your actual answer doesn't matter. Watch for whether she asks why you don't do specific romantic or attentive behaviors, while ignoring different ways you show care that her ex didn't do. Does she acknowledge ways you express love that are different from her ex's style? Or does she only focus on absent behaviors that he performed? If she's measuring your love expressions only by whether they match her ex's, rather than appreciating your distinct approach, she's not actually evaluating your care. She's just comparing you unfavorably. Pay attention to patterns in what she asks why you don't do. Are these behaviors you've never shown interest in, or things you did early in relationship but stopped doing over time? If she's asking why you don't do things you never did, she's expecting you to replicate ex's behavior, despite knowing those behaviors aren't natural to you. If she's asking about things you used to do but stopped, she may be legitimately pointing out relationship deterioration rather than comparing to ex, though the comparison may still be underlying motivation. The long-term impact is you feeling interrogated about perfectly normal aspects of your personality that happen to differ from how her ex operated. You're being asked to justify why you're yourself rather than being like someone else, which creates constant pressure to either defend your natural way of being or change to match invisible standard she won't explicitly state. You'll internalize message that who you are is somehow wrong or insufficient because you don't naturally perform romantic gestures, communication styles, or attentiveness patterns that her ex performed, leaving you in an impossible position of either transforming yourself to match someone else or accepting permanent sense of inadequacy for being yourself. Phrase 4. I just think it's interesting that the pseudo-intellectual critique. This phrase emerges when she's noting difference between you and her ex, but wants to seem analytical rather than comparative. She finds it interesting that you handle stress differently, that you communicate in specific way, or that you approach relationships with particular mindset. The phrase sounds like neutral observation of interesting pattern she's noticed, but it's actually judgment disguised as intellectual curiosity, where interesting means problematic, and the observation is comparison, showing your deficient relative to her ex's approach. The manipulation works by using pseudo-intellectual framing to deliver criticism without seeming critical. When she says she finds something interesting, you interpret this as neutral observation rather than recognizing its coded criticism. She's avoiding direct statement that your behavior bothers her by positioning herself as detached observer, making anthropological note about interesting human behavior pattern, but the pattern she's noting is specifically your deviation from what her ex did that she preferred. She'll deploy this phrase particularly when addressing behavioral patterns that reveal fundamental personality differences between you and her ex. She finds it interesting that you need alone time to recharge when her ex gained energy from socializing. She finds it interesting that you express love through actions when her ex was verbally expressive. Each observation sounds like she's simply noticing differences, but interesting really means concerning, wrong, or inferior, to what she experienced before. Notice whether her statements about what she finds interesting include genuine curiosity about why you operate that way, or whether they're just polite-sounding criticisms. Does she follow up by asking about your perspective and trying to understand your approach, or does she make the observation and then expect you to change? Real interest involves wanting to understand, while fake interest is just an indirect way of expressing disapproval. Watch for whether things she finds interesting are actually unusual behaviors or completely normal traits she's pathologizing because they differ from X. Does she point out genuinely unique patterns, or does she describe standard human variation as though it's remarkable deviation requiring explanation? When someone finds normal personality differences interesting in a pointed way, they're not being analytical. They're being judgmental about ways you're not like person they're unconsciously comparing you to. Pay attention to her tone when she uses this phrase. Does she sound genuinely curious and neutral, or does interesting carry clear subtext of problematic? Can you hear approval in how she frames the observation, or is there unmistakable criticism under intellectual language? When interesting is delivered with edge, skepticism, or concern, rather than genuine curiosity, it's not observation, but comparison, designed to make you feel inadequate, while allowing her plausible deniability about being critical. The long-term impact is you second-guessing completely normal aspects of your personality because they've been flagged as interesting in ways that signal problematic. You're being made to feel like your natural approaches to life, stress, communication, and relationships are somehow unusual or wrong because they differ from someone else's approach that she experienced as normal. You'll either try to modify fundamental aspects of who you are to seem less interesting, or you'll develop defensive posture where you're constantly justifying why you operate the way you do. Explaining yourself to someone who's positioned herself as neutral observer but is actually invested critic, comparing you unfavorably to X. She won't acknowledge, she's still mentally referencing. Phrase 5, that's not how healthy relationships work. The X-based relationship rules. This phrase appears when you're doing something that differs from her relationship history, and instead of acknowledging it as difference in approach, she characterizes your behavior as objectively wrong or unhealthy. Healthy relationships don't operate the way you're suggesting, don't have the boundaries you're establishing, or don't involve the communication patterns you prefer. The phrase sounds like she's citing universal relationship wisdom or psychological research, but she's actually citing her ex's relationship as template for healthy functioning and positioning your different approach as objectively dysfunctional. The manipulation works by presenting her subjective preference based on past relationship experience as objective relationship truth. When she says that's not how healthy relationships work, she's claiming authority based on supposed universal principles rather than admitting she's just comparing you to X who did things differently. You're being told you're objectively wrong rather than just different, which makes defending your approach seem like arguing against relationship health itself rather than simply having different but equally valid perspective. She'll use this phrase specifically when you're establishing boundaries, expressing needs, or suggesting approaches that differ from what she experienced with X. You want more independence than her ex needed, and she claims healthy relationships don't involve that much separation. You communicate differently than her ex did, and she insists healthy relationships require the communication style her ex used. Each claim about healthy relationships is really claim that her ex's approach was correct and yours is dysfunctional. Notice whether her statements about healthy relationships reference actual relationship research, therapeutic principles, or expert advice, or whether they're just her opinions dressed up as universal truths. Does she cite sources, reference couples therapy principles, or mention relationship experts? Or does she just declare what healthy relationships do based entirely on her own experience? When someone claims relationship authority without actual expertise, they're usually just universalizing their personal preferences. Watch for whether her definitions of healthy relationships are actually healthy or just comfortable for her, based on what she's experienced before. Does she claim healthy relationships require things that relationship experts would actually recommend? Or does she label as healthy whatever her ex did, regardless of whether it was actually functional? Sometimes what she calls healthy relationship functioning is actually just what she's used to, even if what she's used to wasn't actually healthy. Pay attention to whether she applies the healthy relationship standard consistently, or only uses it when your behavior differs from her preference. Does she invoke relationship health when you're doing things she dislikes, but ignore health concerns when you're doing things she prefers? If healthy relationship rhetoric is selectively deployed only when critiquing you, rather than being consistent standard applied to both partners, it's manipulation tool rather than genuine commitment to relationship health. The long-term impact is you doubting your own judgment about what constitutes healthy relationship functioning, because she's convinced you that her ex's approach represents universal standard for relationship health. You're accepting her definitions of proper relationship behavior based on her past experience, rather than recognizing that healthy relationships can look many different ways depending on the people involved. You'll conform to relationship patterns she's declaring objectively healthy, even when they don't feel right for you, never realizing you're being asked to replicate her ex's relationship rather than build relationship authentic to who you both are. You're living in relationship governed by rules established by someone who's no longer present, but whose ghost continues dictating how you're allowed to function. Phrase 6. I guess I just have high standards. The defensive comparison. This phrase emerges when you've noticed she's being critical, demanding, or difficult to please, and instead of acknowledging her behavior, she reframes constant dissatisfaction as having high standards you're failing to meet. She's not being unreasonable, she just knows what she wants and refuses to settle for less. The phrase sounds like healthy self-respect and refusal to compromise her worth, but it's actually defensive response that avoids acknowledging she's comparing you to X and finding you lacking, while positioning her comparison-based criticism as justified maintenance of standards. The manipulation works by making her dissatisfaction your failing rather than her comparison problem. When she claims to have high standards, she's positioning you as person who isn't meeting reasonable expectations, rather than acknowledging she's expecting you to meet standards based on specific things her ex did that she's now treating as baseline. Requirements. You're failing to meet her standards, but those standards were created by ex's behavior and aren't actually universal measures of adequate partnership. She'll invoke high standards, particularly when you point out that she seems impossible to please or that nothing you do is ever good enough. Instead of examining whether her expectations are reasonable or rooted in comparison, she declares that she simply has high standards and you're struggling to meet them. This deflects from real issue, that she's measuring you against X, while making you seem like you're asking her to lower standards, rather than questioning whether comparing you to someone else is fair or healthy. Notice whether her so-called high standards are actually about relationship health and mutual respect, or whether they're about specific behaviors her ex performed that you don't naturally do. Does she have standards about fundamental things like honesty, respect, and commitment, or are her standards really about romantic gestures, communication frequency, and specific attention patterns that happen to match what X provided? Real high standards focus on character and treatment. Comparison-based standards focus on performance and behavior. Watch for whether she applies her high standards to herself or only uses them to critique you. Does she hold herself to same standards she expects you to meet? Or does having high standards just mean you should meet her needs, while she's exempt from reciprocal expectations? If high standards only flow one direction and are only invoked when judging you rather than when examining her own behavior, standards are a manipulation tool rather than genuine relationship values she lives by. Pay attention to whether her standards have been clearly communicated and consistent, or whether they seem to escalate and change whenever you meet previous expectation. Did she tell you what she needed and expected from beginning, or does she keep revealing new standards you're supposedly failing to meet? When standards are moving target that expand whenever you achieve previous level, you're not dealing with high but reasonable expectations. You're dealing with comparison to X that ensures you'll always fall short because you're not him. The long-term impact is you accepting permanent state of inadequacy, where nothing you do is ever sufficient, because her standards are actually based on specific person rather than reasonable expectations that any good partner could meet. You're working constantly to meet standards that feel impossible, because they're not actually about being good partner. They're about replicating X's specific behaviors that she's now treating as minimum requirements. You'll exhaust yourself trying to meet high standards that are actually just specific preferences based on comparing you to someone else, never realizing that her dissatisfaction isn't about you failing to be good enough. It's about you being different from X she still measures you against. Phrase 7. My ex used to. The explicit comparison, disguised as casual, mention. This phrase is most obvious form of comparison, where she directly references what her ex used to do, but she frames it as casual mention or random memory, rather than deliberate comparison designed to make you feel inadequate. Her ex used to bring her flowers every week, used to plan surprise trips, used to remember important details, or used to do something you're currently not doing. The phrase sounds like she's just sharing memories or making conversation about her past, but she's actually telling you that she received something from X that you're not providing, and she misses it. The manipulation works by hiding deliberate comparison inside seemingly innocent reminiscence. When she mentions what her ex used to do, you're supposed to hear it as neutral sharing of her relationship history, rather than recognizing its pointed communication that she wants you to do that thing too. She's creating plausible deniability, where she can claim she was just mentioning a memory if you react negatively to comparison, while still delivering clear message about ways you're falling short of what she previously had. She'll bring up what her ex used to do specifically in contexts where the contrast to your current behavior is obvious and painful. You forgot an important date, and she mentions her ex used to remember everything. You're being practical about finances, and she recalls how her ex was spontaneous with money. You're tired after work and not very attentive, and she reminisces about how her ex always had energy for her. Each mention positions X as superior model you're being measured against and found lacking. Notice whether her mentions of X are truly random memories, or whether they're strategically deployed when you're not behaving how she wishes you would. Does she bring up X at completely unrelated times, or do mentions always seem to occur right when you're doing something differently than he did? If X references correlate with moments you're not meeting her expectations, mentions aren't casual memories. They're pointed comparisons designed to communicate dissatisfaction while maintaining deniability. Watch for whether she describes X's behavior with nostalgia and longing, or with neutral matter-of-fact tone that includes acknowledgement of why relationship ended. Does she speak warmly about things X used to do while ignoring that those behaviors coexisted with problems serious enough to end relationship? Or does she provide balanced perspective that includes both positive behaviors and relationship failures? When someone reminisces about X's positive behaviors without acknowledging relationship's actual dysfunction, they're idealizing past to critique present. Pay attention to whether she includes you in conversations about her ex, or talks about him in ways that exclude your presence and perspective. Does she ask whether you want to hear about her ex before sharing, or does she bring him up without checking whether you're comfortable? Does she notice and acknowledge when her ex mentions might make you feel compared, or does she seem oblivious to impact? When someone references X without awareness of how it affects current partner, they're more invested in past relationship than they realize. The long-term impact is you feeling like you're in relationship with two people, her and the ghost of her ex, who continues to set standards you're measured against. You're being told directly about ways her ex pleased her that you're not replicating, which creates constant sense of competition with someone who isn't even present, but somehow remains central figure in your relationship. You'll either try to match or exceed what X used to do, exhausting yourself trying to outperform someone who's been elevated to legendary status through selective memory, or you'll feel permanent inadequacy knowing that she had something with him that she doesn't have with you and may never stop missing. You're in a relationship where you're supposed to be creating new story together, but you're actually being asked to recreate old story with yourself cast in role someone else performed better.